Nostradamus, A Comprehensive History. The Life, Works, and Legacy of Michel de Nostredame, 1503–15 CC. Introduction. Michel de Nostredame, universally recognized by his Latinized name Nostradamus, stands as one of the most enigmatic, controversial, and enduring figures of the European Renaissance. Born in the early 16th century in the sun-drenched landscape of Provence in southern France, he lived during a period of profound intellectual ferment, violent religious upheaval, and devastating epidemiological crisis. He was, in equal measure, a product of his time and a figure who seemed to exist outside of it. To his contemporaries, he was a skilled physician who battled the bubonic plague with unconventional methods, a scholar of the classical arts, an astrologer of growing renown, and eventually, a seer, whose almanacs and prophecies captured the anxieties of a kingdom teetering on the brink of religious civil war. To history, he has become something far more malleable, a projection screen for the fears and hopes of every subsequent generation, a man whose cryptic verses have been credited with predicting everything from the assassination of King Henry II of France to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, the horror of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, and the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. No other individual in Western history has generated so persistent, so commercially lucrative, and so intellectually contested a legacy of prophetic interpretation. The name itself has become a cultural shorthand. When a major disaster occurs, when a political crisis shakes the world, or when society faces a moment of collective anxiety, the name Nostradamus surfaces with remarkable regularity. Internet searches spike. Books are hastily reprinted. Television documentaries are commissioned. Self-styled interpreters emerge to explain with apparent certainty that the prophet from Provence saw it all coming 4.5 centuries ago. Yet almost no one who invokes his name can read the original 16th century French in which he wrote. Almost none has consulted the scholarly editions of his work. The Nostradamus that most people know is a construction, a palimpsest of forgery, mistranslation, commercial exploitation, and genuine literary ambiguity, layered one upon another over 500 years. The purpose of this document is to strip away the accumulated mythology to reveal the historical reality of Michel de Nostredame. This is a task of genuine intellectual challenge. The Nostradamus industry, a centuries-old commercial and propagandistic enterprise dedicated to reinterpreting his work for profit and political purpose, has obscured the real man behind a veil of supernatural awe. Popular culture often portrays him as a wizard peering into a magical bowl, receiving divine transmissions of future events with cinematic clarity. The historical record, however, reveals a far more complex and entirely human individual. A man of Jewish heritage whose ancestors were forced to convert to Catholicism under threat of exile and persecution. A physician who was traumatized by the loss of his own wife and children to the very plague he devoted his career to combating. A writer who used the literary tools of his age, metaphor, anagram, classical allusion, and deliberate grammatical obscurity, to compose a vast poetic commentary on the violent cycles of human history. Understanding Nostradamus properly requires understanding the world in which he lived. The France of the early to mid-16th century was a country on the edge of catastrophe. The Protestant Reformation, launched by Martin Luther in 1517, had split the Christian world. France itself was torn between a Catholic majority and a rapidly growing Calvinist, Huguenot minority. The wars of religion, which would begin in 1562, were already casting their shadow over the country during Nostradamus's most productive years. The Inquisition operated throughout southern France. Heretics were burned at the stake. Conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, lived in constant fear of denunciation. The bubonic plague returned periodically to devastate entire communities. The printing press, barely 2 generations old, was both a revolutionary force for literacy and a dangerous tool for the spread of seditious ideas. Kings and queens consulted astrologers before making state decisions. In this world, the line between medicine, magic, and religion was not merely blurred. It did not exist. It is into this world that Michel de Nostredame was born in 1503, and from this world that his life's work emerged. This comprehensive history will navigate the tension between the believer tradition, which seeks to validate his prophetic powers through retroactive interpretation, and the skeptical or academic tradition, which analyzes his work through the lenses of philology, literary history, and sociology. We will trace his life from the limestone hills of Provence through the plague-stricken towns of southern France, through the halls of the University of Montpellier, through his brief moments of domestic happiness and his devastating personal tragedies, to the glittering court of Catherine de Medici in Paris, and finally back to Salon de Provence, where he died in the summer of 1566, surrounded by the silence of his upstairs study. We will examine the textual history of his works, how they were written, printed, forged, and reforged over the centuries. We will analyze the major claimed predictions in forensic detail, examining both the case for and against prophetic fulfillment. And we will trace the extraordinary journey of his posthumous reputation, from 16th century court sensation to 21st century internet meme. By grounding Nostradamus in the historical reality of 16th century France, we aim to understand why, nearly 500 years after his death, the world is still reading his mail. Lemisurier, 2010. Gerson, 2012. Part I. Origins and Early Life. 1. The town of Saint-Rémy de Provence. Michel de Nostredame was born on December 14, 1503, in the town of Saint-Rémy de Provence. To understand the man, one must understand the soil from which he sprang. Saint-Rémy was not merely a sleepy village, it was a place layered with history. Situated at the foot of the Alpes Mountains, it was built adjacent to the ruins of Glanum, an ancient city founded by the Celts, expanded by the Greeks, and fortified by the Romans. The young Michel would have played among the triumphal arch and the mausoleum of the Julii, visible remnants of an imperial past that would later haunt his prophecies with visions of falling empires and Roman glory. In the early 16th century, Provence had only recently been annexed by the French crown, 1481. It retained a distinct cultural identity, speaking a dialect of Occitan Provençal rather than the French of Paris. Saint-Rémy was a prosperous market town, thriving on the cultivation of wheat, olives, and vines. It was a world dominated by the rhythms of agriculture and the bells of the Catholic Church. However, it was also a crossroads. Its proximity to Avignon, the seat of the papacy during the 14th century and still a papal territory in Nostradamus's time, meant that the region was a hub of international commerce, intellectual exchange, and ecclesiastical power. The town was walled, a necessity in an era where brigandage and mercenary bands were constant threats, creating an insular yet cosmopolitan environment for a young bourgeois boy. 1. Jewish heritage and the Converso legacy. Perhaps the most defining aspect of Nostradamus's identity was one that he was forced to conceal: his Jewish heritage. He was born into a family of new Christians or conversos. The history of Jews in Provence is ancient, but by the late 15th century, the atmosphere had turned toxic. Following the annexation of Provence by France, King Louis XII renewed the pressure on Jewish communities, echoing the catastrophic expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. The choice offered was binary and brutal: convert to Catholicism or face exile and the confiscation of property. Michel's paternal grandfather, Guy Gasselet, was a Jewish grain dealer and notary in Avignon. Around 1455 or 1460, seeing the walls closing in on his community, Gasselet made the pragmatic and painful decision to convert. Upon baptism, he abandoned his Jewish name and adopted the surname de Nostredame, of Our Lady. This choice was highly significant. Adopting the name of the Virgin Mary was a common strategy among converts to signal hyperorthodoxy and shield themselves from the suspicion of Judaizing in secret. Despite this conversion, the stigma of Jewishness, the lack of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, lingered. In the eyes of the old Christians, these families remained suspect. This background instilled in Nostradamus a lifelong habit of secrecy, a mastery of double meanings, and a profound sense of the precariousness of human fortune. Scholars argue that the cryptic nature of his prophecies was not just a stylistic choice, but a survival mechanism inherited from a family that had learned to hide its true face to survive. Family background. Michel was the eldest son of Jaume de Nostredame and Rainière de Saint-Trémy. His father, Jaume, had successfully transitioned from the Jewish gaslit lineage into the respectable Christian bourgeoisie, working as a prosperous grain merchant and notary. The office of notary in Renaissance France was one of significant prestige. Notaries were the custodians of law, contracts, and property deeds, requiring literacy and legal knowledge. This ensured that Michel grew up in a household where books, ink, and parchment were tools of the trade. His mother, Rainière, was the granddaughter of Jean de Saint-Trémy, a physician and treasurer who had also converted from Judaism. The marriage united two prosperous converted families, consolidating their wealth and social standing. Michel was the first of at least 9 children. The family possessed property, including the stone house in Saint-Trémy, which still stands today, and land in the surrounding countryside. While not nobility, they were firmly upper middle class, possessing the resources to educate their brilliant eldest son. Childhood and early education. The education of Michel de Nostredame likely began at home, under the tutelage of his maternal great-grandfather, Jean de Saint-Trémy. While some biographers debate the exact timeline, Jean may have died when Michel was very young. The intellectual influence of the Saint-Trémy lineage is undeniable. In a household of converted intellectuals, education was the ladder to safety. Michel would have been immersed in the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, at an early age. He was introduced to Latin, the universal language of science and the Church, as well as Greek and Hebrew, the keys to ancient wisdom. Tradition holds that it was his grandfather who introduced him to the celestial sciences, mathematics, and astrology. In the early 16th century, these were not considered superstition, but the highest form of science. To know the stars was to know the mind of God and the mechanics of the universe. Young Michel reportedly showed an uncanny memory and a deep fascination with the natural world, spending hours observing the heavens and collecting herbs in the limestone hills of the Alpills, laying the groundwork for his dual career as a physician and an astrologer. Education and medical training. Studies at Avignon. Round the age of 14 or 15, Michel left the safety of Saint-Trémy to enroll at the University of Avignon. Avignon was a vibrant, chaotic city, still dominated by the massive Gothic palace of the popes. The university was a center of humanist learning, where students debated the works of Cicero, Aristotle, and the Church Fathers. Here, Nostradamus formally studied the arts, deepening his command of philosophy and the humanities. However, his academic idyll was cut short. In 1519, just a year into his studies, the plague struck Avignon. The university closed its doors as students and professors fled the Black Death. This was Nostradamus's first encounter with the nemesis that would define his medical career. The Wandering Apothecary, 1521–1529. With the university closed, Nostradamus did not return home to hide. Instead, he embarked on an 8-year odyssey through the south of France, acting as a wandering apothecary. This period is crucial to understanding his medical philosophy. In the 16th century, there was a strict hierarchy in medicine. Physicians, doctors, were university-trained theoreticians who diagnosed based on ancient texts, while apothecaries were tradesmen who mixed herbs and compounds. physicians looked down on apothecaries as mere cooks or laborers. By working as an apothecary, Nostradamus gained something most university doctors lacked: practical, hands-on experience. He traveled through Montpellier, Narbonne, Toulouse, and Bordeaux, learning the properties of plants, minerals, and unguents. He studied the local trade of spices and drugs, learning how to distill essences and preserve substances. It was during these gap years that he began to formulate his ideas about contagion and hygiene, observing that the standard medical treatments of the day, bleeding and purging, often killed patients faster than the disease. He began to experiment with sweeter-smelling compounds, rose hips, and clean water, noting their beneficial effects. 2-3 University of Montpellier and the doctorate. In 1529, Nostradamus arrived at the University of Montpellier, one of the oldest and most prestigious medical schools in Europe, to pursue his doctorate. The curriculum was rigorous, based on the works of Galen and Avicenna. However, his enrollment was not without controversy. The university statutes explicitly forbade anyone who had practiced a manual trade, like being an apothecary, from becoming a doctor. Nostradamus, with his years of wandering and mixing drugs, was technically ineligible. The student register, which still exists, document BIU Montpellier, Register S2, Folio 87, contains a note labeled Michel de Nostredame, where he is accused of having been an apothecary and speaking slanderously of doctors. Despite these frictions, or perhaps because of his undeniable brilliance, he was allowed to continue. He navigated the politics of the faculty, completed his baccalaureate, and eventually earned his doctorate in medicine around 1532 or 1533. This title, Doctor of Medicine, was the key that opened the doors to the upper echelons of society. It gave him the authority to treat nobility, to lecture, and to wear the square cap and long robe of the physician. 2-4 Medical philosophy and innovations. Nostradamus was not a typical Galenic physician. While he understood the theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, his practice was surprisingly modern in its emphasis on hygiene. His most famous contribution to plague medicine was the rose pill. At a time when doctors prescribed drinking mercury or carrying pouches of dried toad, Nostradamus created lozenges made of rose hips, rich in vitamin C, sawdust from green cypress, a mild antiseptic, iris, cloves, and aloe. He instructed patients to keep these in their mouths. While he did not know about germs or viruses, his instructions often broke the chain of infection. He advised the removal of infected corpses, the burning of bedding, and the ventilation of sick rooms. He condemned the practice of bleeding plague victims, correctly surmising that it only weakened them further. In 1555, he published a treatise titled Traité des Fardaments et Confitures, Treatise on Makeup and Jams, which contained recipes for his medicines as well as cosmetics, showing his continued interest in the chemical preparation of substances. The physician in practice. Julius Caesar Scaliger, an Agen. Armed with his doctorate, Nostradamus was invited to the town of Agen by Julius Caesar Scaliger. Scaliger was a giant of the Renaissance, a brilliant, combative, an arrogant humanist scholar who was considered one of the finest minds in Europe. For a young physician like Nostradamus, an invitation from Scaliger was a supreme honor. Nostradamus moved to Agen in the early 1530s, setting up his practice under Scaliger's patronage. The two men shared a deep interest in the occult, poetry, and medicine. For a time, Nostradamus flourished in this intellectual hothouse, enjoying the respect of his peers and the income of a successful practice. 3-2 Tragedy, the death of the first family. In Agen, Nostradamus married a woman of high standing. Her name is a subject of historical debate, often cited as Henriette d'Encausse. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Nostradamus seemed to have achieved the bourgeois dream, a family, a career, and a mentor. But in 1534, the wheel of fortune turned violently. a plague outbreak swept through Agen. In a cruel twist of irony, the physician who was gaining fame for treating the plague could not save his own home. His wife and both children died rapidly. The consequences were catastrophic. Not only was he emotionally shattered, but his professional reputation was destroyed. The citizens of Agen whispered, "What good is a doctor who cannot cure his own kin?" To add insult to injury, his late wife's family sued him for the return of her dowry, a legal battle that drained his finances. Simultaneously, his relationship with the volatile Scaliger collapsed. Whether due to Scaliger's jealousy or Nostradamus's association with heretical ideas, the older scholar turned on him, denouncing him publicly. Nostradamus was left a pariah. 3. The Inquisition and the Wandering Years, 1538–1544. The final blow in Agen came from the Church. In 1538, Nostradamus was accused of heresy. The story goes that he had commented to a workman casting a bronze statue of the Virgin Mary that he was casting devils. This offhand remark was reported to the Inquisitor of Toulouse. Given his Jewish heritage and his interest in forbidden books, a summons from the Inquisition was a potential death sentence. Rather than face the tribunal, Nostradamus fled. Thus began his second great period of wandering, lasting nearly 6 years. He traveled through Italy, visiting Venice, Milan, and Sicily, and throughout France. These lost years are the subject of much legend. It is said that in Italy, he deepened his knowledge of alchemy and prophetic magic, exposed to the Neoplatonic currents of the Italian Renaissance. It was during this time he supposedly encountered a group of Franciscan monks and bowed before a humble swineherd named Felix Peretti, predicting he would one day be pope. Peretti indeed became Pope Sixtus V in 1585, long after Nostradamus's death. 3–4 Plague work in Aix and Lyon. He resurfaced in 1544 to battle a horrific plague outbreak in Marseille, and then in 1546 in Aix-en-Provence. By this time, his fear had been replaced by a grim determination. The Parliament of Provence hired him as a plague doctor. He implemented his strict hygiene protocols and distributed his rose pills. The survival rate in Aix was noticeably higher than in other towns, and the city awarded him a lifetime pension in gratitude. He then moved to Lyon in 1547 to fight another outbreak. These successes restored his reputation, transforming him from a failed exile back into a celebrated medical authority. Astrology and the occult sciences. The world of 16th century astrology. In the 21st century, astrology is dismissed as pseudoscience. In the 16th century, it was the royal art. Kings, popes, and generals did not make moves without consulting the stars. It was believed that the macrocosm, the universe, directly influenced the microcosm, the human body and earthly events. A physician who did not know astrology was considered negligent, as he could not know the best time to bleed a patient or harvest herbs. Nostradamus practiced judicial astrology, the art of judging future events based on planetary positions. 4–2 Methods of divination. Nostradamus, however, went beyond standard horoscopes. He described his method in his writings as a fusion of calculation and divine trance. He would retire to his study at night, surrounded by books of planetary tables. He utilized a method reminiscent of the ancient oracle of Delphi. In Quatrains 1, he writes, he describes using a brass bowl filled with water and touching it with a wand, a laurel or hazel branch, utilizing the technique of scrying, gazing into a reflective surface, to induce a hypnagogic state. In this trance, he claimed to hear voices or see visions of the future, which he would then document. Crucially, he attributed these visions to the Holy Spirit and divine splendor, carefully framing his magic as Christian revelation to avoid the stake. He claimed to burn his occult books after reading them, though this may have been a story to appease the Inquisition. The Almanacs. The first almanac, 1550. Aveing settled in Salon de Provence in 1547, Nostradamus sought a new source of income. In 1550, he published his first almanac. Almanacs were the mass market paperbacks of the Renaissance. They contained calendars, dates for fairs, agricultural advice, and weather forecasts. Nostradamus added a unique twist, prophetic verses for the coming year. Success in literary form. The 1550 Almanac was a runaway bestseller. Its success prompted him to write one every year until his death. These publications spread his name across France and Europe. It was in these almanacs that he honed the quatrain style, a four-line rhyming verse that would become his trademark. The income from these sales made him wealthy, allowing him to devote more time to his great work. However, they also attracted criticism. Intellectuals mocked his vague predictions, and rival astrologers accused him of incompetence in his calculations. Les Prophecies, creation and publication. Conception of the work. Encouraged by the success of the almanacs, Nostradamus conceived of a project of staggering ambition, a book of prophecies that would cover the entire future of humanity from his own time until the end of the world, which he calculated as the year 3797. This work would be titled Les Prophecies. 6. To the century format. He organized the work into centuries, books containing exactly 100 quatrains each. Note: century refers to the number of verses, not a time period of 100 years. The first edition, published in 1555 by Massey Bonham and Lyon, contained the first 3 centuries and part of the fourth. Subsequent editions added more, until the final collected work contained 10 centuries, with century VII remaining incomplete. 6. 3. Deliberate obscurity and linguistic style. Nostradamus wrote in a language that is notoriously difficult to translate. He used a base of Middle French, but heavily salted it with Latin, Greek, Provençal, and Italian words. He used anagrams, scrambling letters to hide names, apocope, dropping the last syllable of words, and complex syntax where the subject and object were often indistinguishable. In his preface to Caesar, his son, he explicitly states that this obscurity was intentional. "I have composed this by misty obnubilation," he wrote. He feared that if he wrote clearly about the fall of kings or the rise of new religions, those of the realm, sect, religion, and faith would find it so ill-agreeing with their petty fancies that they would come to condemn that which future ages will know and perceive to be true. Obscurity was his armor against the Inquisition and the wrath of monarchs. Nostradamus at the French court. 7. 1. Catherine de Medici. His 1555 publication found its most important reader in Paris, Queen Catherine de Medici. The Florentine wife of King Henry II was obsessed with the occult. She surrounded herself with astrologers, magicians, and soothsayers. When she read Nostradamus's almanacs and the new prophecies, which seemed to hint at threats to her husband and children, she summoned him to court. 7. 2. The royal audience and the death of Henry II. Nostradamus traveled to Paris in 1555. The journey was torture for him, as he suffered from severe gout, but the reception was royal. He was given an audience with the king and queen and commissioned to draw up horoscopes for the Valois children. He reportedly told Catherine that her sons would be kings, a prediction that came true, though tragically, as 3 of them, Francis II, Charles IX, Henry III, ascended the throne only to die young and childless, ending the Valois dynasty. His fame was sealed in blood in 1559. King Henry II participated in a jousting tournament. His opponent, the Count of Montgomery, shattered his lance against the king's helmet. A splinter pierced the king's golden visor, entering his eye and brain. Henry died a slow, agonizing death. Supporters of Nostradamus immediately pointed to quatrain I, 35. While skeptics argue this was applied retroactively, the coincidence of the golden cage, visor, and the wound to the eye was shocking enough to make Nostradamus the most feared and famous prophet in Europe. Religious and political context. Nostradamus wrote against the backdrop of the impending French wars of religion, 1562, 1598. France was tearing itself apart. The Protestant Reformation was spreading, and the Catholic monarchy was fighting to maintain control. Civil war, massacres, and heresy trials were daily realities. Nostradamus, though publicly a devout Catholic who dedicated his work to the Pope, filled his quatrains with apocalyptic imagery of clerics being slaughtered, temples being burned, and new sects rising. His work is a mirror of the violent anxiety of the 16th century, where the end of the world seemed not just possible, but imminent. Personal life in Salon de Provence. 9. One-second marriage and domestic life. In 1547, following his wandering years, Nostradamus married Anne Ponsard, a wealthy widow in Salon de Provence. This marriage brought him stability. They had 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. He lived in a large house, now a museum, devoting his mornings to correspondence with the elites of Europe and his nights to his study. He became a pillar of the community, investing in the construction of a canal to irrigate the arid Crau Plain, a project led by engineer Adam de Crapon. 9. 2 final years and death. By the 1560s, Nostradamus was an invalid. His gout had developed into dropsy, edema, congestive heart failure. He could barely move. On July 1, 1566, he reportedly told his secretary, Jeanne de Chavigny, "You will not find me alive at sunrise." The next morning, he was found dead on the floor next to his bed and a specialized bench he used to lift his dropsical legs. He was 62. He was buried in the local Franciscan chapel, though his tomb was later moved to the Cottagecore St. Laurent, where it remains today. Textual history of Les Prophecies. Here is no surviving handwritten manuscript of Les Prophecies. We rely entirely on printed editions, which are riddled with errors. The 16th century printing process was chaotic, spelling was not standardized, and typesetters frequently made mistakes. A change of one letter, for example, printing Arian bronze as air, could completely alter the meaning of a prophecy. Furthermore, after his death, counterfeit editions flooded the market, adding fake quatrains to suit political agendas. Scholars consider the 1568 Benoist Rigaud edition to be the standard text, but the manuscript problem remains a central issue in Nostradamus studies. Interpretation traditions. For 500 years, people have tried to crack the Nostradamus code. This has birthed 2 distinct traditions. The academic tradition, represented by scholars like Pierre Mur, views the quatrains as commentary on 16th century history, ancient Rome, and court gossip, arguing they were never meant to predict the distant future. The popular tradition, represented by authors like Erica Cheetham and John Hogg, views him as a genuine psychic. This tradition often employs the green language theory, arguing that anagrams and soundalikes are keys to decoding names. Like Hitler or Napoleon, this method creates a Rorschach test effect. Each generation sees its own fears reflected in the obscure verses. Major claim predictions. Napoleon Bonaparte, Pau ne Lauron. Quatrain Roman 8, 1 reads, Pau ne Lauron will be more of fire than blood. Believers rearrange the letters of the 3 towns Pau ne Oloron to spell Napoleon. Roy Napoleon the King. Skeptics point out that Pau ne and Oloron are simply 3 real towns in southwest France near Nostradamus's home, and the verse likely refers to local conflicts. Adolf Hitler the Hister. Several quatrains mention a Hister who fights near the Rhine and Danube. Believers see Hister as a close anagram of Hitler. However, Hister is simply the ancient Latin name for the Danube River. Nostradamus was likely writing about battles along the Danube, a common frontier of conflict. The fact that Hitler was born near the Danube is dismissed by skeptics as a coincidence and by believers as a divinely placed clue. September 11, 2001. Quatrain X, 72 states. The year 1999, 7th month, from the sky will come a great king of terror. Believers link this to the 9/11 attacks, despite the two-year date discrepancy, or the rise of terrorism. Skeptics note that July 1999 passed without a king of terror arriving from the sky, marking it as one of Nostradamus's few specific dated failures. Skepticism and scholarly criticism. His primary skeptical argument against Nostradamus is the concept of retroactive clairvoyance post-diction. A prophecy is only successful after the event has happened. Before 1939, no one used Nostradamus to warn of a man named Hitler. The connection was made only after the dictator rose to power. James Randi, the famous debunker, argued that with nearly 1,000 vague quatrains covering universal themes of war, fire, and plague, statistically significant hits are inevitable. This is known as the Barnum effect, statements so vague they can apply to almost any situation. Reception across centuries. Nostradamus has been used as a tool of propaganda for centuries. During World War II, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, forged Nostradamus quatrains to predict the defeat of France and dropped them as leaflets over Allied lines. In retaliation, British intelligence, MI6, hired astrologer Louis de Wohl to write fake quatrains predicting the fall of the Third Reich. During the Cold War, his prophecies were interpreted as foretelling nuclear war between the US and USSR. Pop culture legacy. Ode Nostradamus is a cultural brand. He appears in video games, heavy metal albums, and blockbuster movies. He is the archetype of the wizard prophet. The town of Salon de Provence thrives on his legacy, with the Maison de Nostradamus drawing thousands of tourists annually. He has transcended history to become a symbol of our desire to control the unknown. Conclusion. Michel de Nostredame was neither a fraud nor a magician. He was a brilliant, anxious, and ambitious man of the Renaissance. He was a physician who genuinely sought to heal in an era of death, a poet who tried to make sense of a world tearing itself apart through religion, and a scholar who looked to the stars for order. His prophecies endure not because they are accurate, but because they are art. They are dark, beautiful mirrors that allow us to project our own anxieties onto history. As long as humans fear the future, the ghost of the Doctor of Salon will continue to speak.